Wow, everyone's really quieted down. You must be excited to hear about data and corruption. Like, let's go. Okay, Adrian gives me the thumbs up. So welcome, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. I'm Jennifer Rogers. I'm with the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity here at the law school. A special welcome to all of you who come to us from Exeter's Integrity Forum. It's great to see some new faces, and I hope you'll check us out at CAPI. We do events year-round for the public integrity community and have dozens of publications on our website for practitioners, so please check us out. I want to thank Exeter for their sponsorship of this event and for their support of CAPI more generally. It is very much appreciated. A couple of housekeeping notes. If you're here for CLE credit, please make sure you have signed in and that you sign out at the end when you go. Each of you has a microphone at your seat, so when it comes time for questions, please make sure you turn on your mic to ask your question. That way we can all hear you, and also our live stream audience can hear. Speaking of which, hello live stream audience. We have some folks watching from all over the place, including our friends at the World Bank and some friends at the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Commerce. So welcome to all of you. You can ask us questions if you are watching the live stream by tweeting to us using the hashtag CAPI Integrity Forum. You also can write in the comments of the Facebook live stream, and we'll try to get your questions answered. There's, I don't know, 180 or so folks here, so it'll be probably maybe more questions than we can handle, but we will certainly do our best. I also wanted to draw your attention to something that was part of your CLE materials, but if you didn't see it and you're interested, this is CAPI's report on data analytics and its use in the fight against corruption. It's on our website. It was our stab at trying to figure out how governments in particular can use some of the data that they collect to try to figure out where they're, how it can be used to fight corruption in some of the areas in government where corruption is most likely to be found. So please check that out. And finally, last but not least, I want to introduce my friend, Roy Pollitt, who's going to say a few words and then introduce our moderator. Roy is Managing Director and Head of Investigations for the Americas at Exeter. Before that, he and I worked together when he was at the FBI for 17 years. I can tell you from that experience that Roy is one of the most dogged investigators you would ever come across, certainly that I ever came across, and an excellent agent and worked on all manner of financial investigation and cases. So I know he's taking that experience and doing terrific work at Exeter now, and he's also the one who brought this event to us and coordinated all of this, so I very much appreciate that. So Roy, you want to come on up?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. On behalf of Exeter, I'd just like to thank all of you for coming. I don't know if winter's ever going to leave us, but when I stepped outside this morning and saw ice on the puddles outside my house, I just shook my head. Just actually thank God that it wasn't raining today, so that you guys could all come. So, you know, I'd like to also thank my friend and former colleague, Jennifer Rogers, who is someone, a great sounding board, and someone who I was able to work very closely with for a number of years on some really impactful, large-scale cross-border money laundering and corruption cases. And we've stayed in very close touch and have been talking about trying to do this type of event for a couple of years now, so we're really happy we were able to pull this all together, and we hope that you guys will enjoy the presentation today. I'd also like to thank Rachel Pollan in particular and her team under Jennifer for really working closely with our team, Cody Gerfine, and others at Exeter to pull this event together. It's no easy task to pull together something like this, and we really appreciate all the work that was done behind the scenes to make this hopefully go as smoothly as possible. And finally, I would just like to thank Columbia University Law School and CAPI for hosting this event here. We think, along with CAPI, that this is a very important topic, something that we at Exeter believe strongly in and have fully implemented into everything we do. And we tried to pull together a team that will be very interesting to hear from and should bring a number of different perspectives for you all to enjoy. So without further ado, I'd like to pass this off to our esteemed moderator, Dan Alonso. and please enjoy.
Thanks very much, Roy, and thanks especially to Jennifer and Roy together, whose brainchild this program was, and we really appreciate it. We started the Integrity Forum 2 years ago at Exeter to, bring together people to talk about integrity-related themes, and that's obviously a very broad term. This is the very first one we've done that is not one keynote speaker. It's a panel. We're actually very excited about this format. It's the first one we've ever done with a partner, and obviously the Center for Advancement of Public Integrity is the perfect partner for us to work with. In the past, we've had Attorney General Schneiderman, we've had Maria Vullo, the Superintendent of Financial Services, we've had the head of the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom, and we've really had some quality events, and we're very, very excited for this one. So what I would like to do before we talk about the use of data analytics proactively to root out corruption is I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel. And then I'm going to give you guys a little bit of an introduction to a tiny bit of law and a tiny bit of federal policy, just so that we're all sort of talking about the same stuff as a backdrop to the world of compliance in corporations and government. So to my immediate left is Melissa Ballard. Melissa is Director of Global Anti-Corruption for American Express. She started her career at the Manhattan DA's office, and then she worked for the Bloomberg administration on a wide variety of criminal justice initiatives. And finally, she was an Inspector General at the New York City Department of Investigation. To my right is Stephanie Brooker. She is a partner at Gibson Dunn currently, but previously served as the very first director of the Enforcement Division at the Department of the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. She was also in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia for a number of years, including as chief of the Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering Section. To my far left is my colleague from Exeter, Brandon Daniels, who is the president of Exeter Tech, and he's the global head of analytics at Exeter. Brandon has a long and distinguished career in this field, including managing some of the largest investigatory and regulatory matters to date, including the LIBOR investigation, the Panama Papers financial crime risk, foreign exchange manipulation, and the ISDAFIX industry probes. He is an author and on the editorial board of the General Counsel's Guide to Government Investigations. To my immediate right is Matt Galvin, who is Global Director of Legal and Compliance at Anheuser-Busch InBev, AB InBev, or ABI, and he currently in that role. By the way, they produce a product that I think we can all believe in, Budweiser and all. So in that current role, he oversees the global compliance program covering anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and a couple of other areas, but as relevant to us, anti-corruption and anti-money laundering. He's a lawyer, qualified in both New York and Hong Kong, and practiced at several leading international law firms before joining ABI. Most significantly for today, and I'm actually very excited about this, is Matt has developed a data analytics program called BrewRight at ABI. He's going to be telling us about it, and as a result of that, the Financial Times recognized him in 2016, or recognized the analytics project as the innovative in-house data project of the year, and shortlisted Matt as a leader for innovation among in-house lawyers in North America. So we're very excited to have Matt with us. And last but not least, to my far right, is my Exeter colleague, Ren McEachern. Ren joined Exeter directly from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he worked in Washington, D.C. as a supervisory special agent, leading a team of special agents, forensic accountants, and intelligence analysts focusing on, among other things, the FCPA. In shorthand, Ren was the squad supervisor of the D.C. FBI's FCPA squad in Washington. He has, in that capacity, managed a number of international corruption investigations all over the world, and is truly expert in the government's tackling of foreign corrupt practices. So we have a great panel, and like I said, I want us to all be, talking about the same thing, be on the same page. We are, we styled this as, rooting out corruption, and it is about rooting out corruption. We're going to go a little broader than that. We're going to talk about fraud and other risks, and you'll see how other risks that companies have could inform the corruption question. But a lot of this focuses on transnational corruption, and we're going to be talking a lot about the FCPA, and we're also going to be talking a lot about why it's important to have a good and effective compliance program. So since we have people of lots of different backgrounds here, I wanted to just put everyone on the same page very briefly on selected law and policy. Please do not, this is not a comprehensive lecture. A lecture on this stuff could take a couple of weeks. So this is not something you should take into the government when you're arguing on behalf of a client. This is just basics. So the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is the U.S.'s transnational corruption law. Two main entities enforce this law, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The law has two main provisions, the anti-bribery provision and the accounting and record-keeping provisions of the FCPA. The very, very basic elements of each are right up here. I'm not going to read them, but not surprisingly, the FCPA applies overseas to U.S. persons and entities or issuers of U.S. registered securities, and then some others who might not be applicable to if they're acting within the U.S. And the element is essentially paying a foreign official or other person listed there, including employees of state-owned entities, like, for example, the Brazilian-owned oil company would be a great example of that, for the corrupt purpose of influencing that person to assist the company in obtaining or retaining business to secure an improper advantage. And then there are a few federal jurisdictional elements which are beyond the scope here. But, if you look at this, it should be very familiar to those of you who do local bribery matters. It's not that different. It has a few quirks to it, which FCPA lawyers deal with every day. But essentially, you're trying to make sure that your people in some foreign jurisdiction, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're selling pharmaceuticals to state-owned hospitals in Bangladesh, who is selling that stuff, what are they doing, and how are they effectuating those sales? And that's very important for these companies. And importantly, for those of you who are bribery investigators, the accounting and record-keeping provisions are a little bit of a backdoor. They apply only to issuers of securities, but they are a way to get companies or individuals when you can't prove the corrupt relationship, but you can prove that they disguised a payment. So that often is where some corruption investigations stop. So it's very useful to have the accounting and record-keeping provisions of the FCPA as well. So that's the law. Justice Department policy and U.S. sentencing policy decided many years ago, starting with the U.S. sentencing guidelines in the early 90s, and with this policy of DOJ in 1999, they decided that they were going to encourage effective compliance programs, among lots of other things. So this is called the Principles of Federal Prosecution of Business Organizations. It's got a lot of other shorthand names, but that's the official name. And the idea is that a corporation that's being investigated can get leniency based on a whole bunch of factors like cooperation or voluntary disclosure. Put those aside, the factor we're focusing on here today is the existence and effectiveness of the corporation's pre-existing compliance program. Essentially, when the corporation's arguing for leniency, the government's going to say, yeah, that's great that you're coming here throwing yourself on my mercy, but what did you do before? Before you knew that this was happening, what did you do to try to prevent this? That's the whole issue that we're talking about here. And the law, rather DOJ policy, encourages not just compliance programs, but serious compliance programs. It uses the word effective no fewer than 6 times, and it wants compliance programs to be effective. It specifically says that prosecutors need to look at whether somebody had a real compliance program or what is effectively merely a paper program, and was it designed, implemented, reviewed, and revised in an effective manner. So that is the key. DOJ wants to know that the programs are effective. And as I mentioned briefly, the U.S. sentencing guidelines also talk about corporate compliance, and they give points off a very complicated scheme. They give leniency to corporations if you have an effective compliance program. Now, even though most corporations don't ever want to be before a sentencing court arguing for leniency, the sentencing guidelines are a useful guide for what is an effective compliance program, and it's used widely by corporations. And as you'll see there, It encourages companies to have programs that include monitoring and auditing to detect criminal conduct. So a company's going to be asked the question, what did you do to monitor and audit your program and your employees' behavior? And that's going to be very relevant to our discussion. And finally, the most recent sort of interesting development, exciting if you're an FCPA wonk, I won't go that far. The most interesting development is that the Department of Justice codified an FCPA policy last year, which grew out of a pilot program, and it basically said that we're going to give you a presumption that we're going to decline prosecution if you have fully cooperated, timely and appropriately remediated, in accordance with a long set of guidelines. But they're basically saying we're not going to prosecute you, and we're not going to give you those onerous deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements if you voluntarily disclose in a timely way and you do all sorts of other things. And so that is something which companies at least have to keep in mind. Are we going to go for this, very strong carrot, which if we can show them that we've done everything right, we're actually not going to get prosecuted. So that's the backdrop. There's also a point here which we're going to talk a little bit about monitors later. They're also presuming against the appointment of a monitor if the companies have done certain things right as per the DOJ policy. Those of you who work with monitors know that that's something no company ever wants. Ideally, they want to avoid that. It can cost them a lot of money. It can be very intrusive. So this is a big carrot for companies to sort of do the right thing, self-police, and voluntary disclose. And that's our backdrop today. So what I'd like to do, if I can, is I want to go to Ren first. So I want to ask you about this compliance stuff and an effective compliance program. But why don't you tell us a little bit, since you've been investigating FCPA matters from the point of view of the FBI, tell us a little bit about how those investigations proceed and what the relevance is of these compliance programs, and also how investigations might inform what companies do in developing and monitoring their compliance.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks to Cappy and the Columbia School of Law and everybody for coming today. I really appreciate it. I think it's really been an incredible change, actually, in the last 3 or 4 years with these global resolutions. The stage has certainly changed, and I think now that the U.S. government has found ways to work with other agencies to figure out how to actually share these large fines and deferred prosecution agreements, suddenly we began to see a lot more, guess what, cooperation, right, with other agencies, because suddenly we saw governments realizing if they could work with the U.S., work with the U.K., work with the Brazilians together, they could actually share these large fines and disgorgements, and they were actually much more motivated, right? No surprise. And so now what you're seeing is global resolutions. And so in that format, coming from the government only just a few months ago, what we were doing is sharing a lot of information quickly. And when I say information, I mean intelligence, essentially. So law enforcement to law enforcement, sharing of intelligence to figure out, what is the issue? Are there jurisdictional concerns here for other actors? Are there other agencies that have a play in here? One of the things that I worked on at the Bureau was at the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, the IFBT, to ensure that the sharing of information was occurring so quickly. One of the things I think that's helpful for this room is to understand that when you're looking at matters that are occurring in certain regional areas, you think, oh, this is an area that's just this part of Africa we got to figure out. This isn't a UK issue. The US isn't involved. The sharing information now between agencies and countries is occurring so well and so smoothly that you have to assume that wherever you're mitigating your issues, it's going to be known rather quickly, more than likely. And I say that so you understand fully what you're up against. I think that's helpful. Now, as we look at some of the prosecutions and investigations that I was involved in, I spent a lot of time sitting at long tables in dark conference rooms having discussions about compliance. Companies going through literally years of a resolution saying, we're doing all the right things, we're spending all the right money, we're bringing all the right people in, and the FBI and the DOJ and the SEC would be sitting across the table, and we'd be poking holes at this thing. One of the biggest areas we found a lot of issues where someone would stand up, working on a compliance program for maybe a year and a half, explaining in great detail every 60, 90 days what they're doing, and we would say, great, what do you got? What are the results? Oh, it's still too early. And that's the wrong answer, quite frankly. If your systems are working and you're testing your systems, most importantly, we're going to be seeing some really good results. And I think that's ultimately the question that we would ask a lot on the government side is, are you testing it? And ultimately, are you being proactive? One of the things that we saw that was absorbed when the FCPA pilot program went permanent in November was root cause analysis. What happened here? There's a lot of ones and zeros that are being collected by companies. We'd figure this out. They had all the information, but they couldn't piece it together in a format that said, oh my God, this is the red flag that actually turned into a major series of red flags that could have stopped us way back. And so we would ask questions about those systems and say, what are you doing to prevent, and how are you looking at your data?
Is there a, you may remember in the principles of federal prosecution, they use the word effective, a bunch of times. I mean, what does that mean to you?
So-
When you're sitting across at a conference room talking about compliance?
Effective
Which is no one's romantic view of what FBI agents do, by the way. But
Yeah, I tend to think like joining the FBI, be sitting across the table from lawyers in conference rooms talking about effective compliance, but actually it's something I really quite enjoyed because you would see companies really kind of get there. Because at first, some companies, by the way, never get there, right? It's kind of sad. They spend all this money and time, they don't get there. But we would also get to see some companies really get there and find best practices and really begin to find their own in that space. Effective means something different for every company, quite frankly. It really depends on where your risk is, but effective is certainly, number one, is making sure that your compliance people are being heard and have direct access to the decision makers within the company. That's a big change too that's coming down with some of these new stuff in the manual. We want to see CCOs that are empowered within the company, right? We want them to be able to make decisions and have access to maybe the audit committee or maybe the board in some cases. A company that we were actually working with had a weekly call every Monday for 15 minutes between the CEO and the CCO. I'm not saying you have to do that, but that was certainly a great indicator that they were listening, that they wanted to be effective. I think that was really important. Most importantly, I think, is understanding that the world we live in now is getting very complicated with the big data problem. And we saw this from the FBI. We had a big data problem in the FBI. It's really difficult. And so we would ask a lot of questions about companies, asking them, okay, guys, you're collecting all these great red flags. What are you doing with them? How are you aggregating them? How are you understanding them? And how are you mitigating them? And how are you not going crazy saying all these false red flags, which would often happen, where they would come and say, look, we're chasing all these flags. In the end of the day, they weren't real, right? These ghost red flags we talk about. The trick with data analytics is really getting down to the flags that count the most and putting your people on those to be effective and say, this is a good use of my time. And we would ask those questions a lot.
So I want to turn to Brendan and ask him to give us a little introduction to data analytics and how it can be used in compliance. But first, I thought I would get sort of an additional view on this question of an effective program, Stephanie. You saw this both from the government point of view and now representing companies at Gibson Dunn. What does that mean to you, an effective compliance program?
What I think we're seeing across companies as this emphasis on effectiveness continues to grow is really taking concepts that we know more in the financial services space of 3 lines of defense, the business, compliance, internal audit, and bringing that outside of just the banking space where it's well-trod ground to other types of companies. So I think, in terms of demonstrating effective compliance, what I saw in the government and now representing clients before DOJ and other agencies is really being able to point to concrete steps. So in the first line of defense, I think really over the past 5 years, a focus on a culture of compliance within the business. I think, many of us are involved in matters where you can have a great second line and third line, but if you don't have the right culture in the first line, it can be difficult for the rest of the control framework to kick in. So that's the first issue. It's, town halls with company employees at all levels, regular email communications on culture of compliance, the annual training. These are all ways that we see effectiveness being demonstrated within companies. And then in the second line, I think there's been an interesting evolution that you can't just rely on internal audit to do the implementation testing. So we see across compliance programs a QA/QC within the second line of defense as well. So that internal audit is really the third line of defense and should be catching very little if the first line and second line are working effectively. And I think the final point I'd make in terms of implementation, again, adopting a concept from the banking world, is risk assessments. I think 10 years ago, the thought that a non-financial institution would be doing an annual risk assessment was really foreign. But I think that has also become a DOJ, SEC regulatory expectation that companies will be doing an annual risk assessment in order to make sure they focused on where are their risks, what are the controls, and then where's your residual risk that you need to continue to focus on.
Matt, do you agree that we should export the very tight and long-developed regime in financial institutions to regular corporates like yours? Does that make sense for most companies?
I think it really, at a high level, it does, to have a regime of different checks and balances on a business and to manage risk in that way. I think once you get beyond that high level, I think businesses need to do what they're good at. If your business is very good at marketing, you should be very good at marketing compliance. If your business is very good at data science, you should be very good at using data science and compliance. You take the tools of what you have at your company and fit them to task. And I think that's one thing that I think, the challenge of a compliance officer is to move beyond the kind of, either we're trained in a law firm, we're trained in a prosecutor's office. We're really not trained in business. But to put yourself within the business and figure out how to make that business compliant, rather than put yourself in compliance and how to bring that business to compliance.
Great. So with that, Brandon, first tell us, what is data analytics? Put us all on the same baseline, and then I'd like you to go a little bit into how that is useful in compliance.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, data analytics is self-defining in the term, right? So it's data analysis. But in a strict sense, it's analyzing data sets, typically large ones, because if I can consume it in a short period of time, then the data in and of itself is the analytic, right? It is what allows you to draw an insight, draw a point, draw something meaningful out of it. But it's the organization and analysis of data sets in order to drive decision making. That's the way that I think about it. And I think about it that way in two different manners. So one, it helps me to understand the efficacy of an operational process. So most of the time when we think about data analytics, we think about interesting visualizations of risk across our organization, or different transaction patterns that are occurring with our third-party vendors. But sometimes operational risk is just as detrimental as essentially the risk that is inherently occurring within your organization, right? So having too many data points to analyze can vary risk, can make it so that risk is hard to identify. And so, for instance, understanding how quickly people are going through, let's say, alerts off of a transaction monitoring system, or how effective your team is at reviewing cases that you pick up in an internal investigations
Stay a
unit.
little more basic, though. You've gone to the transaction monitoring system. That's advanced.
But what I'm essentially saying is there's the first type of analytics, which is operational risk, and then there's the second type of analytics, which is actually looking at your data and systems to draw meaningful insights from them for business practice purposes. And in the context of compliance, data analytics is doing something like not just looking at what honoraria you've given to medical staff or healthcare professionals in hospitals that are state-owned, but actually combining those with the sales that you've had with those state-owned enterprise, and looking at the nexus, right? Looking at where essentially your potential payments or benefit to the hospital might have aligned almost in a unique way to essentially economic benefit to your organization. So I look at these in two ways, Dan, and that's why I brought this up. There's analytics that helps you to drive and understand an operational process, and then there's analytic that helps you to understand operational risk, or excuse me, that allows you to understand business risk more effectively.
So I'm a lawyer in the legal department, and my boss has said, hey, I heard that you can proactively use data analytics to root out corruption, and we want to make sure that when Ren McEachern comes knocking, that we're going to have an answer to this compliance issue. I don't know anything about this. How do you begin to do this if you're a large corporation or even a medium-sized corporation subject to the FCPA and other bribery laws?
Yeah, I mean, so this goes to the point around essentially effective compliance that you've been mentioning, right? And there are three areas where I think data analytics can play a large role in allowing you to effectively manage compliance. First is in your risk assessment, right? So very often when we complete a risk assessment, it's very subjective in nature. It is driven by a large number of interviews, a large amount of business input that occurs in a sort of colloquial fashion, right? And the first area where I see data analytics being used is in that risk assessment process, to help you understand where you might have financial concentration with certain vendors, with certain distributors, with certain customers, right? Understanding and validating those assumptions, because very often people's bias or what they see every day gives them a false impression of what's actually occurring in the business. The second thing is to then look at where risk may actually occur. And this goes to the area of predictive analytics, right? So it's essentially saying, where have we seen risk in the past, and how does it align to some of these areas of financial concentration risk, third-party vendor risk, the types of third parties that we're dealing with, right? So if corporate sponsorships has typically been an issue in recent FCPA enforcement cases, looking at your benchmark corporate sponsorships and how those compare with corporate sponsorships in that region. Corporate sponsorships that are occurring in your industry, to see if you've outstripped or outsized what is the norm, right? And then I think the third thing in terms of your risk assessment is also just checking that the hypotheses that you've made about those risks play out in reality. So doing some testing, doing some back testing, actually saying, so if I apply this analysis, if I apply this risk assessment, if I tier my vendors, if I tier my distributors using the risk assessment that I've built, am I actually coming out to probative results, right? So I think that's the first area, is in the risk assessment. I think secondarily, it's monitoring. And I think, again, it's a continuous test of whether or not that risk assessment has led to probative results. And then third is clearly in investigations. I think Ren hit on one thing that's really critical. 30, 60, 90, 120, 180, 2-year-long investigations are incredibly frustrating in the context of regulatory enforcement action. And having been on the other side of those, I know that the timelines to effectively analyzing and effectively making decisions in an investigation can often take that long. I think an effective strategy for an investigation in a corruption case is bringing data analytics to bear. So this is where I got into data analytics. It was insufferable to wait 6 months, 9 months to have 200 attorneys get through 1 million documents and a room full of forensic accountants to get through 200 million transactions. It was impossible to wait that long. And so I think using data analytics, you can draw on some of these unique points of nexus, as I mentioned, right? So those points of nexus, again, so it's not good enough to tell me that I've got 55 transactions that are unique to a certain type of vendor, or 55 payments, or 55 gifts or travel expenses that I've given to them. please combine that with something that allows me to make a meaningful decision. Did they have any economic benefit? Do they have any government ties? Are they in a country that has emerging risks? Are they in a country that has, state-owned enterprises, right? So combining information, bringing together information that allows you to have meaningful insights is so critical in an investigation. And it's really data analytics that allows you to do that.
So that's very helpful, this concept of combining. Melissa, I want to ask you about that in the government, but before I do that, what he said sounds really expensive, right? It sounds like something that, it sounds like, wow, there's all this data and it sounds expensive. What do you think from your point of view as you sit in a large corporation? Is it worth the cost?
Absolutely. So, and we've had this discussion, is bringing all this data together, is this something that in the corporate world is just a cost center, one of those necessary evils, we have to do it? Or is this something that can really be leveraged in other places? And I think of, our global financial crimes compliant group, and maybe just take a step back for a second. Within the financial institutions, generally, we are organized in those GFCC, or Global Financial Crimes Compliance Group, where all the data across all of our lines of business are coming together and then using by the disciplines of AML, anti-corruption, and sanctions with overlap within those three pillars. And so I think that because of the regulatory expectations, and as Stephanie laid it out really nicely, we have come a long way in bringing all of that information together. And now I think we're at a point where we can look at it as, how is that information useful in other parts of the company? How does it, how do we predict product attributes? How are we going to protect our customers better? Where is there changes that, from a revenue generating perspective, we can work together? And I think you're exactly right, like setting that culture of compliance and working together. It's important to maintain the integrity and focus and mission of a financial crimes investigation unit, but that doesn't mean you have to work at odds. But to answer your specific question, yeah, it's expensive in the implementation stages and building those things out, but I think the rewards and financial benefits really outweigh that initial investment. You're going to get it back in terms of corporate learnings, before you even get to costs associated with reputational risk or investigative resources or monitorships or all the things that can go wrong and bad if you don't invest.
I think the other thing that you bring up, which is a great point, is there are already so many investments that our organizations are making into drawing insight from data, that why wouldn't we also leverage those, right? So I've seen these beautiful graphs from the marketing departments in large pharmaceutical companies showing, different distributors and how they're how effective they are at selling through products. In the area of the corporate card space, you'll see these fraud analytics that help you to protect the customer. I mean, a lot of times it's just transitioning that same kind of analytic and overlaying our domain of corruption risk on top of it, right? I think that's really what we're talking about here, is data analytics is happening to drive so many other parts of our business. And where we see data analytics being valuable is bringing our domain expertise to it and allowing us to either explore, right, new issues or emerging issues, to help us to determine whether or not our hypothesis is right. So we set up all these complex scenarios of risk, and we need something to tell us whether or not we're getting it wrong, right? Or to even predict where there might be an issue.
Yeah, and I think there's lessons learned, so at least the way we're over it, you have all that information going into one place where analysts are looking at it on a transactional basis, right? They're looking at a particular customer and what's going on with that person. But if you were to ask an analyst who'd been looking at years worth of cases of, that are alerting for, abuses to like membership rewards on a card, they're going to have perspectives and lessons learned and observations that different lines of business are then going to benefit from. Yeah. I think the global financial crimes compliance groups are uniquely situated in that they're seeing across products and have a vast amount of data.
Sorry, I wanted to ask Matt if he agrees with you. We're going to hear in a few minutes about project that you implemented at AB InBev, but just on the specific question of, it sounds expensive, is it a cost center or a cost saver? What do you think?
Well, you certainly have to make the initial investment, but once you take the steps of bringing, say, your accounting system data together, and your T&E data together, and your general ledger together, and you really understand that data and can visualize it, once you start solving for corruption, you're not just solving for corruption, right? Corruption is money leaving the company in a way that the company doesn't really want. It just happens to be going to the government. Quite often, long-running corruption schemes have a fraud and leakage component too, right? Once you start paying bribes off books, people get greedy and you start taking some to yourself, you start giving some to your buddy. Same with T&E expense fraud. And as you go through this and get really good at it, you're not just solving for corruption, but you're also solving for fraud and leakage. And there, if you can capture the returns, you have a very powerful way to communicate to management that, well, we found, a $50,000 duplicate payment this week, we found a $70,000, fraud scheme, there's a conflict of interest scheme, because you have the data. And, you can really show a lot of return from that. And
So, thank you, Matt. Stephanie, we've heard about AML programs a little bit here, and I know that they're not specifically looking for the kind of corruption we've been talking about, but how do you think the more sort of mature AML area can inform this project of rooting out corruption proactively?
I think the transition from having, standalone units within companies looking at AML, corruption, and sanctions into a global financial crimes framework has been a very positive development. In the financial institution world, and it'll be interesting to see how this evolves, the fourth pillar is becoming cyber. And there's a lot of discussion within the financial services world of how do you bring that together, because in the cyber world you have people who have obviously hardcore IT training, have not been as involved in issues of compliance, reporting, and that becomes particularly complicated for companies that have mandatory reporting requirements within a very specific time frame, like the SAR regime for financial institutions. So I think that's, one of the questions, as we sit here focused primarily on corruption, that has really become part of a bigger picture that both has data analytics components to it, but also, frankly, hiring and culture components to it. And we really see over the last few years, as cyber has begun to become more prominent, that is a real rub point within companies, bringing them into the fold of this global financial crimes compliance framework.
But are you saying that say a manufacturing company that is not subject to the AML rules of federal law, should they implement an AML program?
What we see, I think, within the private practice world and also within the government world as well, is some variation. A number of large multinational companies have brought AML into their compliance framework. Not in the same way, of course, as financial institutions regulated by the Bank Secrecy Act. It's just not necessary. But to at least have it a component of the program and educate employees on AML red flags, which often cross over into corruption red flags. And so, what we'll recommend for non-banks and other types of companies that are not regulated by the BSA is include AML in your code of conduct. As part of the annual training, don't do another training on AML, just add it and focus on things like payment policies. Employees, we've had a number of matters for non-financial institutions that employees just didn't quite see the red flag with payments. So things like if I'm getting payments from a third party that has no relationship to my customer, I need to ask questions about that. For the more mature companies, they've been educated on a strict payment policy that you can't allow that, and there have to be exceptions if you're going to allow it up the management chain. So I think those are some of the areas where we counsel introducing AML into the mix without having an undue extra compliance burden and cost burden on what are already, as we've talked about, very costly systems already.
Ren, when you and your colleagues in the Department of Justice were evaluating compliance programs, were you looking for anti-money laundering compliance in companies that were not required to do that under the law?
The answer is yes, generally, because we want to see a whole solution. And in the FCPA world, there's always about how you get the money out of the company, right? Without that, if you can't figure out how to get the money out, then you're actually going to have some good internal controls. So we're always looking at the AML world. And by the way, we always charged AML or money laundering charges with FCPA. They go hand in glove. And actually, when we did FCPA investigations, we simply started by tracing the money, and then the case would actually form around that, right? So whether you have those BSA responsibilities or not, you have a responsibility to understand, a fiduciary responsibility to understand your monies, right? As a company, don't you want to know what's going on with your money ins and outs? And so I think we would look at that all the time and talk about that and how those relationships are important and making sure you understand those relationships, because it was always about the money in the end.
We keep tossing around BSA, that's the Bank Secrecy Act where the anti-money laundering rules come from. So there's a lot of people here from DOI and other state and city agencies. I want to talk about how this plays with the government, but I don't want to interrupt our flow about how you do this in a private corporation. So I think it's a good moment to hear from Matt Galvin about Brew Right. So I'll turn it over to you, Matt.
So it's funny, a lot of what's been said here, it reminds me of conversations that I had with senior management with the board. You know, to Ren's point, when we, a few years ago, about 2 years ago, we were looking at the acquisition of SAB Miller, and an acquisition of $100 billion that took on 24 operations in different countries, almost standalone operations. And we thought about the process of how you would integrate the compliance program for those 24 businesses and how you would do that. And, you know, a lot of it was, you know, you follow the money, right? You look and see what they're spending money on. A lot of it was talking to management. But like a lot of people here, I grew up as a lawyer, which was probably the most awful time in the history of man to grow up as a lawyer. Because you had all these conceptions of, okay, you have an investigation, you need to look at the documents, you need to look at the data. But every year, the size of the documents and the size of the data grew exponentially. And looking at the task at hand of trying to figure out how to integrate the compliance systems or the compliance programs in these 24 countries, I'm like, how many 28-year-olds must die to do this diligence exercise? And we decided to think of a better way to do it. And the traditional way would be to murder the 28-year-olds and look at the documents and do kind of random testing of, say, 24 businesses. You pick them out. Say 11 would be like a principal basis. I don't know how you get to 11, but generally people think 11 of 24 is good enough. And then they would go and they'd look and do some testing, and then maybe they'd fly to Nigeria and they'd fly to Panama and they'd do an investigation. Maybe you fire some people and you get this great report. And, you know, having come from private practice, I remember with fondness the idea of like a $6 million report and that being a good thing. In-house, that's not a great thing. We had to come up with a better solution. How do we integrate this and not just do a post-acquisition diligence exercise, but do it in a way that we'd actually integrate, that we could actually monitor, that we could actually manage. And so instead of sending the teams out, we brought the data in. And then once you bring all the data in, you have a few problems. It's a lot of data. You have to figure out how to sort and harmonize. We took 24 different systems ultimately, actually 31 now, and figure out how to take really 31 separate databases of information, right? 31 separate Excel spreadsheets, and merge them into really effectively one database, right? That's a problem in and of itself. Then, once you have all that, you decide what you're going to score. And we thought, okay, we could simulate the test that, say, an accountant of 10 years experience could start with, and then use that, run it across a harmonized set of data, and have that spit out, what's risky. So, for example, in corruption, as Exeger and others know, we pay vendors in very long payment terms, 120 days. You tend not to pay a bribe with 120-day payment terms, right? Shorter payment cycles, money leaving the company quicker, is indicative of risk. Round number payments in countries with high corruption perceptions index, payments in countries where the World Bank ease of doing business standard is lower than others. And you can start to get a fairly good landscape of risk on a payment-by-payment basis. And then we thought, as this goes along, that's going to be really good to start. We have to figure out a way of, as we then take those risk scores and have people look at them, that is going to be great. You're just going to have a good test kind of going on, and it'll be better than the random test of taking your 30 most random selections. And again, it's another one of those numbers that people that took statistics in college tell me 30 is like a magic number. I don't understand. So we scored all of it. And then as people go through it, right, you can then feedback loop and have the system teach those KPIs to get smarter. You know, much in the way lawyers in the room, you've seen that in document reviews. You take your star associate, you have the computer kind of shadow what they're doing, and then you regress analysis to what they were looking at, and go on. You do the same thing with this sort of analysis. And then you create a system that you have all this data, and you start kind of risk scoring different aspects of it. And other people want to start to use it. And so it's not just a conversation with internal control, well, we have too much cash and checks and gone. It's, okay, how do we monitor it? How do we see it? And I have a system for you. And I have a system telling you every transaction in your system what we think is risky and what's not. And you're communicating through a dynamic system that has live feeds of data that are getting smarter, that you're then providing effectively virtual legal advice to other constituent groups within the company. So that was our approach. And no 28-year-olds died. We took the data and combined these 34 different systems, right? ERP system is enterprise resource planning, right? That's your backbone accounting system. It's your general ledger, it's your procurement system, it's your cash. For us, it monitors free beer. We took them and did that exercise with those 34 separate kind of ever-moving spreadsheets, found a way to combine them into one. Tied a series of algorithms. We talked to a whole bunch of really smart forensic accountants. And we started testing for fraud, money, corruption, anti-money laundering. Developed a user interface that would allow people to then put the results in, and then you go. Now, the first and hardest part about that, and I gloss over it very quickly, is getting the data, right? We closed in SAB Miller on October 10th. By October 1st, we found an existing basic infrastructure within the company that we allowed us to get 13 different countries and 50 different companies on one platform very quickly by March 1st. And then you start moving, right? I've learned a lot in this process because I'm a trained lawyer, right? I knew nothing about software development. I knew very little about IT. I just knew, right, we had a problem, we had to solve it in a fairly innovative way. And you learn a few things, right? I mean, you learn first that it's not a good idea to take all of that data and put them in one place and run your test there and have everyone kind of then have the visualization on it, because it's very slow. If you bring that many data sources in a single place, and then you start going and you have this great theme about machine learning, right? You turn on the system, you see these visuals, and you like spend a lot of time visualizing this is going to be the risk map, and you say, okay, I want to zoom here, and you hit it, and you're all excited, and you're going to go, and then it's like, waiting. And then 10 minutes later, and then I spent a lot of time convincing people that actually this saved us, like that was like 9 months of work done in 10 minutes, and you should be really happy. But if you're sitting there watching a computer program and like you have your Apple iPhone that's like you can play any music at any time, 10 minutes seems very slow. And so we learned how to kind of tier and stagger the data and have different pathways and pre-run computations and put them in separate component parts and then make the visualizations kind of more unique. And now it works like people with iPhones, and people are a lot happier. So that kind of works in tandem while you're getting more data. So you're kind of bringing in, you're solving problems like that, you're solving structural problems. We brought in another 24 countries, and at the end of last year, we had 94 countries. All of the systems for accounting, which means we can see and run tests in different modules on the accounting systems live and in a dynamic format for payments, which is corruption, fraud risk. Duplicate payments, right? We mentioned before, how do you see a return on investment? And I thought, okay, my mission in life isn't to stop duplicate payments in the company, but if I'm going to get all of that data, and then one good way to kind of create a slush fund would be to pay a fake vendor twice. So I cared about it anyway. But if I set up a whole work stream with audit and control that then use this kind of logic and machine learning and applied application to duplicate payments, there's very few ways to save money faster in an organization the size of mine than to eliminate duplicate payments and to do it. And then you get budget. And the same with conflict of interest, not a core area, but a great investment for other groups to come in and a key risk. We took our T&E systems, brought them in, Sanctions, I was happy when Ren said that because we did go through the trouble, even though not subject to the BSA. Of, yeah, T&E. Oh, yeah, right. We brought in T&E, but we did an AML sanctions review on a platform on this. Now, one of the initial learnings from this was the 1.0 version of this, it was like one dashboard that you could zoom in and out of systems anywhere. And it was really cool, but I realized only me and like the head of internal audit would ever figure out how to use it. And so this kind of breaking into workflows allowed kind of you to have discrete teams. I can have a team in India focused on duplicate payments. I can have a team in Brazil focused on T&E. I can have a group, you know, otherwise look at beer, free beer leaving the company. And it allows you to both kind of create security, because once you have all this data in one place, you're worried it's a lot of power. And by having tiers of focus, and then you can kind of cross-reference with geography, you can kind of control who has access to what and who sees what. It also allows you to create different levels of privilege. As much as I love my friends from the government in this room here, I don't necessarily want to immediately give all of my data and every kind of risk scores and what I think, which is really my legal advice, how I'm applying that to the systems, and make it publicly available. So by having different portals of interest and entry, you can create privilege structures within the data and with investigation flows, and have certain aspects of the data, as you're confident in the quality of the data and the risk and the level of sensitivity, like duplicate payments, you can put that out of the privilege sphere. But as I go through my payments and my corruption risk score, I can keep it within one. And the system is moving. I mean, we have new things on the way. You know, one thing I'm particularly proud of is we took the same logic and application that we applied to payments, and we applied it to our investigations database. Like a lot of companies, you know, we have a lot of whistleblowing activity, a lot of investigation activity. And you know, when I first joined, you could kind of figure out what was what where, and it was more based on a system of how to respond to things. But if you take them all, aggregate them, and look for patterns, you can see very quickly, say, right now I can tell you if the Me Too movement, what countries it's actually affecting claims of sexual harassment, and what brewery may have a problem. Or where do I not have a problem? Where is no one reporting, and where I probably have a really big problem? And I can look for trends and patterns in the investigations data as well. And then you can take things like that and you can start to combine different data sources. And that's, you know, another area that gets really fun. That we have this pool of thousands of vendors. And a lot of people, you know, you run diligence. And diligence is great for about the 15 minutes after you run the diligence, right? You get a little, you know, outcome, the vendor's okay, we can bring them in. Godspeed, go practice law in Lagos. Now, if you take your kind of normal subjective diligence and you get comfortable with your Nigerian lawyer, you then can combine whatever subjective risk profile that you put on them. You know, do they have great compliance procedures? Who else is using them? Or they come on any lists? Combine that with payment patterns. Combine that with any history of investigations involving them. Combine that with any sort of proximity to the AML list, and you have a holistic 360 view of all of your vendors. And as people work in different parts of the program, and the program's getting smarter, your holistic 360 view of all your vendors gets smarter too. And then you really have a good sense of who you're doing business with and where. And so all these different streams and work streams, as they get better, as the underlying data gets better, as the programs get better, as the risk scoring gets better, the whole system informs itself. And you can start to see how it works. Now, where are we going? I view this as we're in kind of year 2 of the 5-year plan. You know, it was very fit for purpose in terms of getting a lot of comfort on how to do diligence in a very complicated 24-country, broad international diligence exercise. It's now at a very good point where we are seeing the results of that. And when we have feedback and shut down vendors, or when we see control put in, you know, a program that we're reducing checks in sub-Saharan Africa, I can track and monitor that. We put in a training on beer. I can track and monitor how much free beer is going where. We put in new rules in T&E. I can track and monitor exactly the impact of the rules of T&E everywhere the system is. And so we're going from that, okay, what was the risk assessment, to what is impact? And I think one of the challenges for compliance right now is compliance is moving from a mentality where we get A for effort. Now we should get A for results, right? How many vendors did you see that you actually canceled? How did T&E go down? How did my aggregate risk score get impacted by our compliance program. Every module that I showed you gets scored. Every transaction gets scored, every vendor gets scored, every lunch gets scored, everything gets scored. It's all put through the lens of where I started with, right, the Transparency International, World Bank. But what you have and where we're going over the next 8 months is going to be a dynamic risk score for every country and every operation of the 95 countries where we're operating. I will be able to see from a very elaborate model how we're doing. And it's an amazing way to communicate. I think one thing we haven't covered so much is the power of analytics and visualization to communicate to management. That if you have your data and your ability to visualize, right? Management can react to a lawyer's ranting and raving all they want, but there's nothing like a map with a heat chart and a scatter plot to focus the mind and solve a problem, particularly in the boardroom. And I have maps and scatter plots for virtually every risk that I'm covering and facing. And then, so then, the next phase of that would be to tie remuneration targets to risk score. First with compliance and then across the business. And then everyone has to kind of come into the system and play the game. It's a very elaborate way to manage teams of compliance officers and teams of business around the world. That they have to think, access, see what the machine is driving them to do. And remember, the machine will perpetually be getting smarter because the underlying data sources get better. And nothing is wasted. All activity happens within the ecosystem. So it moves forward. And what I hope to see at year 4 is that we will be stopping and predicting corrupt and fraudulent payments before they're made. Because as the models get better, as the risk scores get better, and as more people use it, right, it's the kind of system that the more people use, the better everything is. And you'll be able to see exactly what is predictive within a payment and stop it before it happens. And that's among the to me, the very exciting and cool parts of approaching traditional compliance problems through applied analytics and engagement.
So Matt,
Yeah.
one question. In your pitch to management, is a part of this that also, at the point at which the models reach maturity and this program reaches maturity, you're actually going to accelerate the speed at which they can conduct business, right?
Right.
So best way to find a piece of glass in a pool, drain the pool, right? So you're actually establishing what's good as well.
Yeah.
And you're letting that free flow of commerce happen.
Yeah.
Is that a part of your pitch, that by actually setting up these models, you're going to be creating a much more transparent environment in which you can do business faster, more efficiently, with less of those blocks happening on things that aren't going to be material?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's any number of discussions that happen. I mean, one of the first steps is, as a company, you have to embrace a very transparent way to approach this problem, right? But once you have that transparency, it's kind of what Ren was saying is you should know where your money's going and you should know how you're approaching the problem. And there's nothing people in the business like less than a diligence form that they do and send away. I think they'll like slightly better a diligence form that they go in and they can actually see the impact. And they can see the impact in their score, they can see the impact on their business, and they can say, oh, I can kind of see how this works.
Yeah.
And just the commercial benefit of having that much data that easy to use so quickly, you bring people, I mean, I'm probably in some ways the most compliance officer, the most popular compliance officer in the world because people want my system, they want to come in. This is not, I don't know how your life is. People tend not to want to have lunch with compliance officers.
I'm not popular.
But you're actually building something and bringing them to you rather than just being the hall monitor telling people to walk slower.
Matt, how did you all think through the cross-border data privacy issues, and to your point of if the government comes knocking, you want to be able to segregate what you have to turn over?
Yeah, I mean, it's two separate issues. I mean, if you look at the map in the first 34 countries, very few of them had much of any of data privacy regime, right? We went through the South African one, the Indian one. When you go to Colombia, they have kind of a basic one, and then you get more. You get more complicated as you obviously move into Europe and move into data restrictions across Russia and the Ukraine. And what you do is a few things. You have levels of anonymity, high levels of control, high degrees of pockets that only certain people can access, escalation provisions. Like T&E data is horribly sensitive, both in terms of just like the salacious nature of what you can find in it and having kind of a system of controls of or what do you need before you can access, and you need at least a few points to go in and access to get it. And then the transfer issues are more complicated, and you have kind of your virtual silos and virtual servers to kind of get around some of the transfer restrictions. So carefully is the answer. In terms of the privilege, again, a lot of it's about having these separate dashboard and siloed structures, having kind of different groups of people with different kind of levels of degree of instruction from attorneys, working within them with different reporting lines and access, again, through control and access.
So you mentioned machine learning. We haven't really gone over that. First of all, is that something you use in this? And maybe you or Brandon give a 30-second definition of what that means.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I mentioned that you start with, we applied something like 64 different tests to, say, a payment, or it was like 40 tests to a payment. And then, as you go through, you also say, okay, I'm testing these things, but there's also other factors, right? Size, day of the week, what time of month, keywords in the payment, and all of those become a separate channel and a data point, right, that you're looking at. And say, okay, my 20 tests say this is a hot payment, we need to look at it. And then these other tests are kind of out there. With machine learning, what it does is if you have a workflow that's based in a single ecosystem, and your analyst goes through and makes some phone calls and does some check, either you're going to say problem or not a problem. Either way, that's relevant information. That particular combination of those 20 factors and those other 40 that you thought to capture are together in that time and place indicated not a problem. And then a slightly different factor in a slightly different place equals a problem. And as you go through buckets of problems and not problems, and you get a seed set of about 500 positives and 1,000 or 2,000 negatives, you can start to make pretty good assumptions about which combination of those factors, either you're testing for or not, give rise to an issue. And that's machine learning. It's taking that data set, taking out your factors, kind of doing then just simple math to say this combination 50% of the time was a problem, this combination 10% of the time, and it affected here, this combination 5% of the time. And each one of those coefficients, or each one of those kind of variables, you start weighting them as like a coefficient in a very long math formula, and you can weight and get down to a more probative outcome. I mean, that's the basic level of machine learning. I think you can probably go into thinking about how to bring in AI or more advanced models into play.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. What machine learning is, what it does is it focuses you on what are the probative points of data across a set of risks, right? So if I think that my risk is, just to go to something more colloquial, right? So if I told you that there were 31,000 deaths related to doctor's office visits, you'd say, geez, I don't want to go, or every year related to doctor's office visits, you'd say, geez, I don't want to go to the doctor's office. But then if I took a broader set of data and I said, well, now I'm going to take into account where car accidents happen, it's actually because 30,999 of them are traffic collisions that happen on the way to the doctor's office because people are distracted, right? And so what machine learning can help you to do is to, again, test that hypothesis. So I think the risk is that duplicate payments to vendors might expose risk. Well, duplicate payments to vendors or high-frequency payments to vendors might actually be of no risk. That might be paying my phone bills, paying my, the consultants that are sitting as subcontractors in my organization every month. That might not be indicia of risk. But what machine learning will do is it'll allow you to tie together the transactions that you are finding that are high risk and expose new data points and say, actually, the risk is not high frequency. It's high frequency payments that happen multiple times in a month. And machine learning allows you to get there, dredge up that probative risk that is hidden within your data, and start to categorize new information based upon that new key risk indicator.
Great.
Thanks.
So, hearing about this and then wanting to segue into the government area, which I want to ask Melissa about, kind of reminds me of that movie Minority Report, where they predict the crimes before they happen, and, you know, it strikes me that if Matt is gonna be able to know
Which would be a
about-
long ethics panel unto
Yeah,
itself.
exactly. But if Matt's not gonna know about, Matt's not gonna know about corrupt payments before they happen, possibly, if you could do that. So if DOI could do that, you were an inspector general, I mean, how great would that be?
Fantastic.
So what do you think? Tell us about what your experience was with the city and how this can all be applied to Inspector General work.
Sure. I mean, so what an amazing time it was to be an inspector general for Mayor Bloomberg, right? The data-driven mayor. We were flush with data. It really came down to understanding. And so my last year at DOI, I was the inspector general of 13 city agencies. I mean, that's just a tremendous amount of processes, disciplines, ideas, units, and figuring out who keeps relevant data and then how to ask the right questions of that data, I think is the struggle that government has, or anyone really has. And there's always the question of resources, right? And so how do you take that concept of risk ranking to what is the data set that if I devote some time and energy into understanding is going to return rewards? Is it looking at inspection data and asking the right questions of that, right? Like over the last 20 years, there have been a fair number of corruption cases involving inspectors. So maybe that's where I focus. And so I think that was the challenge of figuring out what the data is. And then also thinking about when you use data that's collected for one purpose, but you're using it for a completely different purpose, there's some learnings there of how people are recording it, why they're recording it, what's the nomenclature. So those, you really have to get in and understand how it's being collected, the culture of that group or unit, and then how to extract what you want from it. And I've seen the same thing in the corporate sense, right? We are using transactional data that's captured on customer activity, but we're looking at it, you know, for different reasons, and making sure that you're accounting for that, I think, is an important element.
I think that's another thing is that's a bit of a misnomer, or not a misnomer. I guess it's a misconception. I think in many areas of legal and compliance, that data analytics or machine learning or AI are a replacement for talented investigators, compliance individuals, or legal talent. It's not, because at the very outset, you need to understand what's material and what's not. And this ranking of data sets, right, is so critical to understanding the value of bringing your this data set into a compliance program, right? So some data sets can be misleading. So sometimes analyzing my vendor population or analyzing my distributors by the volume of spend with them is going to put IBM up to the chain in most big corporates every single time. And IBM, I mean, not saying anything that I'm aware of, but at least at the moment is not a huge corruption risk to me. Whereas I might have smaller financial relationships which are really problematic and could create dramatic risk inside of my organization. In fact, when you look at the top 10 enforcement actions in the last 20 years, the vast majority of them involve a third-party payment and don't involve third-party payments to large organizations where there was a huge amount of financial risk.
It really is. It's those low-value, you know, like contracts, those third parties where, you know, that we are laser-like focused on. That is where the risk is.
And so I think this understanding of what are the operational processes that you have within your business that can connote risk, that can essentially take on risk, and then looking at the controls and understanding what data sources are available to those controls that allow you to understand what you want to analyze in a data analytics process, what you want the compliance team to look at from a materiality perspective. And I think combining data analytics with compliance and legal professionals is really where the material changes to your environment can occur, right? It's not data analytics and machine learning and AI alone. you always have to have someone to determine materiality of an issue or of a data point.
And Matt, out of curiosity, how many people do you have working on your project?
I think internally, you have probably about 8 full-time dedicated people, another 60 with a target where their bonus is related to their performance on it, and then any number of kind of teams of data scientists and forensic accountants working at any time, either making the system better or looking at the risk score data.
So continuing on our government theme, Stephanie, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what the federal government is doing in terms of using data analytics proactively. We've been talking about compliance. I was thinking maybe there would be great investigative uses for data analytics.
No, I think that's right. And, I think the government has come a long way over the past decade, but obviously is nowhere near the conversation that we're having with Brandon and Matt. I think some areas of focus for the government in trying to move from paper-based analytics to data analytics that I would highlight. And it's interesting that, again, the government is not where the companies are, but yet you have these incredibly heightened expectations from DOJ and the FBI and others. I think one of the hallmarks of improvement we've seen from the government perspective over the past decade is in how DOJ, working with the federal law enforcement agencies, are running task forces that focus on all the suspicious activity reporting that banks, broker-dealers, casinos, money service businesses who are required to make suspicious activity reports to the government, how that data is being used. And, at the time that I was running a SAR review task force in 2010, 2012, we were still at a point that groups of agents like Ren would come to the U.S. Attorney's Office from FBI, IRS, DEA, ATF, local police departments, and sit around a room for a day with a stack of hundreds and hundreds of SARs and decide, yes, we're going to open an investigation on this one, no, we're not on that one. And it was completely random. And you would try to impose dollar thresholds for the suspicious activity, or this month we're going to focus on where a bank said, I think this is a corruption-related payment, and next month we're going to focus on the checkbox for human trafficking. And there would be rudimentary systems to try to say, well, I think we focused on a SAR on this one 3 months ago, but is that the same one we looked at 6 months ago? And it was really taking a massive amount of data. I mean, the system holds 11 years worth of records of SARs that financial institutions are filing, and try to come up with a reason why government investigative resources were being pointed in that direction. And, I think, look, some interesting, important cases came out of it, but were you really focusing on the ones that merited attention in a time of limited resources? I don't think so. So even within the government, there's been improvements in trying to use transaction monitoring systems, as Brandon was talking about, to feed the data from all of this reporting into systems that can help investigators focus on the most important filings to then focus their resources on the right investigations. And, I think we see that growing in a couple of different ways in other government settings. The SEC has done a lot to take the massive amount of data they have from surveillance systems and other SAR reporting. They look at it as well and try to focus in on where there are hot spots that the government should be focusing its resources. And I think, my most recent former agency, FinCEN, which is the Treasury Bureau that is the lead anti-money laundering regulator for the U.S., is the repository of all of that suspicious activity reporting from all of the financial institutions across the U.S. who are required to file every day on suspicious activity. And I really saw a lot of advancement and focus of resources on bringing the advanced analytics and the systems, SaaS and others that exist within companies to try to do advanced analytics on all of the reporting, and then importantly package that reporting in a way that it worked for government agencies that could have access to it. So doing advanced analytic reports for banking agencies to say you're monitoring these 100 banks, these are areas where we're seeing risk within those banks of money laundering related transactions. Or foreign regulator in another country, we're going to sanitize the information but let you know that we see particular types of AML and corruption risk through a bank in a given jurisdiction. So I think, the government has recognized the need for advanced analytics from an investigative standpoint, from the enforcement agencies, but I think we have a long way to go in terms of spreading that across other types of government agencies that provide services in order to make their use of resources and, frankly, taxpayer money more effective.
Stephanie makes a great point that I just want to key off of, which is when these organizations are looking at SARs, and I've had the opportunity to work with one regulator in Asia specifically on this issue, they're not just looking at the financial institutions, right? They're looking at the totality of the activity that's occurring in the suspicious activity. So in many instances, you'll have corporates that have been RFI'd by financial institutions for suspicious payments.
More jargon, a request for information.
Oh yeah, sorry. Request. So you're a corporate and you've got a request for information about certain payments you've made to certain vendors that might be attached to suspicious activity, right? And so if the first time you're having a conversation around what that request for information from a bank could mean is during that enforcement action, you're in big trouble. So this goes back to a point Stephanie made earlier. Making sure that AML is a part of that compliance culture training is so critical so that you understand how payments can impact your organization, how vendors, distributors, or the through the financial institutions that you're working with, right? And so bringing this to a holistic view, I think not only having an awareness of the risks that are associated with FCPA and AML issues as a part of your training, but then rounding that out with an analytics strategy creates a much more holistic environment inside of a corporate.
So what you're saying is your bank might rat you out, so you might as well find it yourself first. Matt, did you want to say something?
Sure. Just to go back to, the initial question about how this can change conducting internal investigations and also the question of return on investment. We had a case study where before we kind of had built our system, we'll respond to news reports, and if there's a series of agents in, say, Brazil or Guatemala or China, we'll conduct a proactive investigation to see if we have any exposure to people under investigation. And traditionally, this sort of exercise, you want to look at your exposure with a series of agents. I would come up with the plan, and I would talk to external counsel, and there'd be a group of people on the phone. We'd have a conversation about it. Great. They would talk to forensic accountants, who would then kind of talk to my organization, and that would take about 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, you have another conference call, and then you spend the first 20 minutes trying to remember what the hell you're doing in this conference call, and then you have about 6 different people, and you're like, okay, great, you found these facts and you found these payments. You should look at these 10. And then you do it, over weeks. This adds up tremendously from a cost perspective and an efficiency perspective. If you have all that information there, we could simulate that same investigation with me, one other person, and one investigator on the ground, and you're quickly looking at the payments in real time, kind of see, we need to prioritize here, we need to look at this and do that. And there was an investigation that, in its first form, took $1.8 million, and its second took $200,000. The savings was astronomical. And it's just way more fun to conduct an investigation where you're like quickly seeing this pattern, we gotta look at that, move, and then we can monitor, right? If the outcome of that doesn't have to be like a Caesar, get rid of them or not, it can be like, well, we should actually put them on, let's weight the risk for that vendor a little bit more and see what comes up. And so the level of, it changes the nature of the game dramatically.
Yeah, and I would also add, I think an extraordinary development in internal investigations and that cost factor is the use of technology-assisted review for these mass quantities of data, in terms of emails, other documents within a company, that we are now in a world where all of the sophisticated companies within their litigation management function have technology-assisted review, and you will run hit reports across custodians and be told there are 2 million records that the STAR associates are going to have to sift through. And as you go along and the TAR brain is being fed, all of a sudden you're at 100,000. And that is being accepted, not just in the US, but also in the work that I do with foreign enforcement agencies, that is an accepted model that you can be considered subpoena compliant, but having used technology-assisted review to get those numbers way down. And it is just a huge efficiency cost savings for companies.
Great. So Melissa, what about, we've talked about government law enforcement agencies like DOI, like FinCEN. What about government operational agencies, like, say, the State Department of Motor Vehicles or the City Department of Finance? I mean, should they be, in your view, thinking of themselves the same way as private companies do and using these kind of techniques?
Absolutely. If you can leverage your data, there's findings that you can then change operations. And I think as companies think about it, there's kind of two considerations. Is one, you don't have to boil the ocean, right? You don't have to spend years and millions of dollars developing a system. You've got to find out where your biggest return is and have some quick wins and immediate results that you can then play off of. And I think you need to focus on not getting so stuck in your current manual process that you just try to replicate that, in some kind of technology solution, that you think about how do you re-engineer your process to capture that data and do things more efficiently.
I mean, I would suggest, and I'd love to hear from you guys, that they almost have more of an imperative to do this because if you screw up at the Department of Motor Vehicles, somebody's going to blame the governor, right? And that's going to be,
Everyone has increasing expectation in dwindling resources, right? So for that upfront investment, you really can put your resources other places. And I think people get stuck thinking this is such a big task, it's so expensive, who do I go to, how do I get the funding or the budget, that you need to have a more agile approach where you're just kind of finding discrete problems and tackling them.
Yeah, and it's not always complex, right? So one of the challenges many people have in the financial industry is determining what geographies touched a transaction, right? So SWIFT records are notoriously bad, and SWIFT is the message that's used to communicate between banks, right? SWIFT records are notoriously bad for holding information that's probative to risk, right? It's meant to make sure that money gets into an account as quickly and as seamlessly as possible, right? And so people are spending millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to figure out what countries, what risk-laden countries might have touched a transaction, right? When if you take it all the way back to the beginning, if you could just make it so that every single wire system required you to have a checkbox for what country the money was coming from, we'd solve the problem, right? So there are so many ways to, I hate the term skin a cat, but it's appropriate here. There are so many ways to tackle the same challenge. Some of them don't have to be complex in nature. Some of them can be rudimentary changes to the process, but using the data to determine where those fault points are or where those small changes can make big impacts is also a good use of data analytics.
And I think that the output, right, that presentation to whomever your management is that has, good pie charts and graphics, that single, I call them the sexy slides, right? Like that's what's going to advance your position on why to put that investment in, what you can get out of it.
That's right, yeah.
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute. I mean, you're, if I'm not mistaken, a Fortune 200 company, or I think a Fortune 100 company. I mean, it's all well and good for companies that have a lot of money and a lot of risk and a lot of stuff going on. But I didn't see in those policies that I put up, or the U.S. sentencing guidelines, I didn't see a requirement that you had to do proactive data analytics in order to have an effective compliance program. So I'm asking, are you just an innovator, or are you a trailblazer? I mean, is this something that's going to become best practice or standard, and should it?
Yeah, I think if you look at what the Justice Guidelines are asking you to do, if you read, Hui's memorandum on what an effective compliance program is, and then you also look at the COSO guidelines on control, proactive data analytics answers all of those questions. It answers kind of adjudicating impact of compliance effort. It answers ongoing risk assessment. It answers monitoring. And you're actually influencing behavior. I mean, I think it's not the only way to do it, but it's certainly a very powerful way to simultaneously cut investigation costs, reduce fraud, have a fairly good degree of confidence that the business is actually doing what you're asking it to do, and achieving compliance.
But realistically, so
Yeah.
Ren, you're, a company's presenting to you and to a prosecutor, and Stephanie, maybe you're the defense lawyer presenting. I mean, is it going to become an issue when you say to them, do you have brew right, just like AB InBev? And if the answer is no, you're screwed? I mean, what's the reality here?
So believe it or not, the government can be reasonable, and I think that's the right approach. We've never seen anybody come in and present like this, and so that would be one of those moments like innovation, clearly. The government's always going to say, what are you doing to prevent it going forward? But we also realize that not everybody's going to have the resources or the buy-in to create such wonderful systems. But if you look at the new manual and kind of the new guidance, they need to get buy-in from the top down to the middle, down to the bottom. They need to find ways to kind of get ahead of it. They talk about root cause analysis. They talk about going forward. They talk about marrying culture with your compliance. They're going to look at all of those things and say, what can you afford? What should you be doing in that space? But they would never hold you to some sort of level yet of that kind of resource. But I think what you're going to see is over time, when companies are coming forward more and more with systems like this, and they're realizing that it is cost effective, and that companies, even medium-sized companies, can do it, the standard will then begin to change. And so then you will have to actually figure out, when you have to go in front of the government, or really hopefully before that, this is the standard. And it's kind of a strange area when the government sets the standard for something like technology, but once more and more companies start coming in, and every week the government's seeing more systems like this come in, when somebody doesn't come in with that system, they're going to say, wait a minute, guys, everybody else is able to afford this and do this. Are you really here to cooperate, or are you just kind of playing games with the government? So I think people have to be very cognizant to say, what's the future look like?
I think
Melissa,
it is,
go ahead.
yeah, I do think it is the reality, right? It's the expectation, and even before you get to an investigation, just from regulators, when they come in and assess your program, what do you have, what are you doing? And I think we've gotten very good at collecting data, thinking about kind of volume-driven metrics, but I think as it was said earlier, like the expectation is, well, what are your results and what are you getting out of it? And while the model has been, you hire up those 28-year-olds to look at that. At some point, that model isn't sustainable. You can't just continue to hire people to look at more and more data. You have to think about a smarter way to do it.
Yeah, this is what has happened in financial services, is this huge volume of operational risk related to thousands of people, all with their own individual bias, their own background, their own experience, looking at transactions or looking at economic activity, looking at customers and making different decisions which aren't coherent and don't make sense, right? So I've had people in banks say, I have 2,000 people all with a one-page checklist. I might as well have 2,000 different checklists, right? Because they all bring their own level of bias to it, right? And when what has happened in financial services is we've chased the pain, right? We're behind the eight ball, so we keep throwing more and more resources at it. If we go back to the beginning, I think we do a lot of things differently in terms of correcting our data, right? Getting the right level of analysis, understanding what's truly probative, because now going backwards is near to impossible. It's a lot bigger challenge from a regulatory expectation perspective.
What do you think, Stephanie, in your role representing companies before the government? I mean, if they say to you, your company didn't have proactive data analytics, what do you say? Is that a strong argument on the government side, or do you have the better of the argument today?
No, I think today it is not a DOJ expectation that you have predictive analytics. Totally different world in financial services with banks and the banking regulators. I mean, again, it is at this point a de facto expectation that you will have a rigorous transaction monitoring system. But I think outside of that unique space, we're not there yet. Now, we may be soon as more companies establish that as the baseline. But at this point, I think you can successfully navigate a DOJ investigation showing a robust compliance program that is not at that level of data analytics.
So I want to ask Matt one last question, then give the panel a couple of minutes, and then I'll take your questions. My last question is, the government in FCPA cases over the last 10 years has been notorious in imposing these rigorous, costly monitorships that are intrusive and that no company likes. Now, companies like Exeter love monitorships because we like being monitors, but a company, doesn't like that. Is there a role for the stuff we've been talking about in compliance monitorships?
No, I agree. I mean, my first experience with a monitorship was being on a monitor team, and I mean, that's how I went to New Zealand. And why a compliance monitor would ever go to New Zealand says a lot about compliance monitorships and their effectiveness generally. But I think, there is room. It seems to be very duplicative if you're taking a traditional role and you're telling a company with counsel that they need to hire a second counsel to adjudicate what the first counsel is doing, particularly if you're still in that mindset of an A for effort mindset, where the first counsel is trying to get an A and they're showing all these processes and work, and then the monitor counsel also is like, okay, well, we can do that too. We can put a lot of effort in too. And you end up with these kind of multiple gears going without anyone asking yourself, did you really change the underlying conduct? To me, what this offers is the potential for having an overlay that provides kind of an agreed objective source of truth. If you're assigning KPIs that are tested and go across industries that are educated and fairly probative in terms of what the risk is, this is a far better way to have someone come in and spend a lot of effort to adjudicate someone else's effort. It's much more objective and results driven. And to me, it is an incredible opportunity to provide at least a different mentality to contrast against what the company counsel is doing, as opposed to just doing and repeating the same kind of activity over again.
Ren?
I do think one small important part, being involved in the monitor selection process and the interviewing, looking forward, the department and the government has asked, and often you'll see when a group comes in to solicit for monitorship, they're very careful about now who they're partnering with, and they do come up with this forensic discussion on analytics and data. This does come up. And the firms that I think have a lot of success are being very careful to make sure that whoever they're partnering with has that capability, because number one, the company is saying the same thing. We want to be efficient here. We don't want to have to spend 5 years and hundreds of millions of dollars on a monitorship. How can we be better about that? And the government's saying, okay, well, make sure you're partnering with groups that can understand that. As long as we're okay with those methodologies and we're accepting those reports to get you that certification, I think the government is looking more and more at that, looking forward, not backwards.
Great. So I'd like to take audience questions. So take the next few minutes to think about them. I'm going to give each of our panelists just a minute or less just for final thoughts, starting with you, Ren.
I think most importantly, which I mentioned briefly, but I'll restate it. The standard will be changing, guys, and it's going to change through resolutions. And so when more and more companies come through, like AB InBev, and they start showing solutions like that, the government's going to start asking or requiring essentially that kind of data analytics and that kind of technology to make sure people are really taking on risk and understanding how to mitigate it. It's the best interest of everybody. It's an efficient process. It's a time-saving process. And it takes these really long, for example, in FCPA cases, 4 years on average in the U.S., 7 years internationally. It really makes it much more reasonable in time and scope. So I think that's the future. It's coming, whether you're ready for it or not.
Thanks. Stephanie, minute or less?
I think we will continue to see these developments in the advanced analytics space, but I think what should not be lost is the continued focus, and it's pretty old school, on a culture of compliance within the business. All of these fancy systems are ultimately there to catch problems, and I think, whatever fancy system you bring in to DOJ, the questions are going to be about what was the culture and how did this happen, and how have you made advances in your training and your hiring, your retention, to have that not happen again. So I think, I just don't want the focus to get lost in what are great slides on, I think, what the areas of focus will continue to be.
Matt?
Sure, and I think there's two things. One, as you move, I think culture is important, and as you move away from an A for effort mentality in compliance and how do you get results, you look at the culture and how you can achieve it. At AB InBev, I looked at a culture that was very analytics driven, and very result driven. And so I spoke to the business by developing a system of compliance that was analytics driven and results. And to do that, I think we have to change what a compliance professional and what a compliance team is. When I inherited the compliance program at AB InBev, it was 95% lawyers and one forensic accountant that I think was hired by accident. And the program that I see, it's going to be 60% lawyers, 20% accountants, and 20% computer engineers and data scientists, because that's how we can run the system.
Very cool. Melissa?
Yeah, so, as someone in compliance, is a recovering attorney, not a background in technology, initially, these conversations about data analytics and AI, it can seem really complicated, and it's like going to require math, and it really I think you can demystify it a bit, that there's some practical solutions. Once you kind of get down to the principles, that's where we're headed, and I think, you need to embrace it with enthusiasm, because there's a lot of power there.
That's terrific. Brandon, a minute or less.
I think the biggest thing is that I think everything that the panelists have said in their closing comments, I agree with. It's important to have a culture of compliance, but there are some firms after the financial crisis. There are some issues that we've seen in emerging markets where we thought we had a culture of compliance, right? Where the company that eventually was subject to an enforcement action was the darling of the street, or was, espoused a really open corporate culture. But without having something to check and challenge that culture and to understand whether or not that culture is trickling down into the day-to-day practices of the business, data analytics is a method, or is an opportunity to have a check and challenge, to say, okay, so I believe that my company looks out for the best interest of my customer, but is the way that we're charging fees actually supporting that, right? I believe that we hold our distributors to strict standards, but is the way that we sell stents into emerging markets supporting that, right? So it's a critical linkage between data and, I think, compliance culture that meets in really that sort of check and challenge function.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So we do have some time for some questions. I think, did we get one online? Great. Since we're streaming, we got a couple of questions online. But let me give first dibs to the folks who are here. Yes, sir. You first.
Hi.
No, right behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Hi, my question's for Matt. So it sounds like you've got this fantastic program in place at AB InBev. Can you talk a little bit about how long it took when you took over to transition to a big data program instead of a very, on-the-ground, lawyers-driven program? And, what sort of cost you're talking about and how it was built? Was it done internally, or did you use external consultants?
Sure. No, it's almost 2 years ago to the date the general counsel said, Matt, you need to do two things. You need to integrate SAB Miller, and you need to resolve an ongoing investigation into our former joint venture partner in India. So it's 2 years since start of conception of idea to execution. And I really think we're kind of year 2 of a 5-year plan. We were fortunate to find an infrastructure within SAB that we could get data relatively quickly, from October to March, and then get the rest in another 4 months. But there's a lot of other teams, and you have to again reorchestrate how you're building the data sets. You need teams of people to go in. You need to really think through the visualizations. You need to think through the privilege. You need to think through the user, the security, the data privacy. So yeah, it costs a little bit of money. I think though, to be honest, the money that we've invested in that, well, millions, and we used a number of consultants, starting with the Big Four and an outside law firm, and now have moved kind of more resources in India and internalized almost all of the project. Though Exeter is actually working on some of the review and the forensic work as well. I think we're both seeing returns in terms of catching fraud and seeing money kind of flow back from it. As I mentioned, I saw huge returns in kind of speed of investigations. I see returns in the efficiency of compliance teams, not needing, while, moving from, 150,000 employees to 230,000 and not having to, have that same proportionate increase necessarily in compliance teams because of efficiencies realized, reducing infrastructure and just that. I think we see a lot of returns everywhere. And I think we'll continue to see that as we move through the years to year 5 of the plan.
Great. Sir?
Hi. I have 2 questions for Matt. The first is, as far as behavior change is concerned, I was wondering if you've seen any behavior change towards trying to innovate around your innovation and what you're doing to combat that, and also whether or not any institutional investors have taken interest in your system.
I think on the first one, I would say, I would answer your question first that the level of transparency really changes the management discussion at the senior level. If I say, head of control tells me we're going to remove cash in Africa, I say, great. And she says, no, we've already done it. I'm like, no, you haven't. I can see immediately right here where, this transaction. But with all of that, transparency comes risk. You worry that one of your analysts is going to go rogue and download everything and take it, to whomever. You worry that, potential, gamification, that they say, okay, you're testing round number payments, haha, we'll test everything will have a penny after it. And so with any kind of system that you're going to try and catch someone who doesn't want to be caught, you're going to have to be live and kind of nimble. And the system accommodates that. You have to have a system that not only the inputs, that KPIs are kind of educating themselves, but other proactive investigations or whistleblower investigations, we learn from those. And we do them on the system as well. And we say, okay, in those 20 KPIs, we're going to add another 5, or we'll add another 10, or these factors. And that affects regression analysis and the models and the risk scoring. And so you have to have that sort of dynamic review and other data sources inputting into it. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of end up repeating yourself and people will game you. From the institutional investor question, I think there is opportunity. I think this is where the space is going. And I think there is opportunity for this to be kind of proliferated and kind of spread outward.
All right, we have a question online, and I think this is probably best given to Melissa. How do we convince large institutions resistant to change that this kind of internal-facing data analytics is worth pursuing?
Show them how to save money.
That's it?
No, I mean, yeah. Well, save money or serve our customers better, or their customers better. I think, getting it down and giving those results in a digestible, direct, compelling manner.
And maybe give ancillary benefits, like what you've been talking about. You can actually manage the company better with some of the stuff that you're presenting for the first time in an easily digestible way.
No, absolutely. As a head of compliance, you're kind of a merchant of crisis. You're either trying to get money for the crisis to avoid the crisis forthcoming, or there's a crisis happening, and you're at that point get budget. Never waste a crisis is one, and 2, I think there are a lot of benefits to running your business in this way.
Rahm Emanuel, I think, said that. Question from the audience for our panel? Yes, sir, in the back. And you have a microphone in front of you.
Hi. It definitely seems like the wave of the future.
Press the button.
Oh,
No, maybe you had it pressed. Apologies. Sorry about that.
it definitely seems like the wave of the future. But I was just curious, do you have any suggestions about protecting or avoiding allegations in the future of such either discrimination or in a human rights context? Because the data, of course, once gathered, can be utilized perhaps as a disparate impact type of claim as well.
So the allegations of what was the word used? Discrimination?
Discrimination
Got
or
it,
human
got it.
rights
Okay.
violations.
The question is whether this kind of data can perhaps be used in a discriminatory way, and how do you protect yourself proactively from that?
I'll take first shot. I think, first of all, there has to be a check on me. There's a very fascinating article that went to Bloomberg yesterday about an analytics program that went awry, and the head of compliance at a major financial institution was seen They saw a test indicator of people showing up late to work. That showed disenfranchisement, and that made them higher risk of fraud. And he ended up sending like investigative teams to go after people with sick children instead. To answer your question more directly, I mean, I think so long as you have kind of you're constantly reviewing what you're testing for, and then you have, you know, kind of empirical evidence, you know, regression analysis is math. These factors mathematically add up to be probative of likely future outcomes. And so long as you know that there's limits to those models and there's limits to those math, I actually think it's a tool to reduce potential prejudice in investigative outcomes or in what you investigate or how you look at, because you're driven more by mathematical models that a group of people can control and see. But it's a great question, and I think there is tremendous opportunity for compliance. There's also realistic opportunity for abuse in any system like this.
All right, we have time for one more question before we wrap up the program, if anyone would like to. Yes, Laura.
How do you convince your management that it's a good thing to have problems, that it's a good thing that your system is showing red flags, as opposed to, you know, a transaction monitoring system that doesn't generate any investigative leads?
Who wants to take that? Brandon? Melissa?
Well, I think it was said earlier, like when you have a system or a process that's showing quarter over quarter that there's nothing going wrong, you really have to challenge the foundations of that process. Because, you know, no matter what industry you're in or how sophisticated your monitoring programs are, like you're still dealing with people, right? In scenarios. And so I think it really is the setting expectations of, you know, nothing can eliminate the risk or the bad activity, but you can catch it and use that learning to prevent it more times than not.
All right, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.